Ladies and gentlemen, the title of this report is A Historical Approach to the Concept of Childhood and Modern Children's Literature in Iran. Modern children's literature emerged as the consequence of changing attitudes toward the concept of childhood and a more clear definition of children's stages of development in the early of 20th century. To survey the emergence of the modern children's literature in Iran, it is essential to know how the concept of childhood was defined and what children's lives were like at that period. The concept of childhood is mingled with the beliefs of a nation. Therefore, it is basically a historical phenomenon, and it should be investigated by taking the country's social and cultural background into consideration. Considering children as different from adults dates back to ancient times, when children were educated at temples and special courtesy and literary texts were first narrated orally and later put in writing for them. Recently, many clay exercise tablets dating to 1500 to 2000 BC have been found in southern Iran. It is evident that they were used by teachers, and children would write their exercises on these tablets. In addition to children's oral literature, children enjoyed written stories, which dates back to the Sassanid period. One such story is the Asurik tree, the story of the palm date and the goat, a Pahlavi manuscript dating back to about 2000 years ago. In Iran, although different religions, from Zoroastrianism to Islam, and distinguished thinkers and philosophers in the Islamic period had different views and attitudes toward children and their special needs, children have always been considered as innocent creatures that should be educated. Interestingly, this attitude was the complete opposite of the Christian attitude toward the child as the fruit of guilt in the Middle Ages. In his book, Kanun, Avicenna, the distinguished Iranian philosopher and physician, has defined the characteristics of childhood and paid considerable attention to the different stages of children's development and needs. In the Republic, Plato, who was a contemporary of Avicenna's, refers to Iranian children's upbringing as very progressive. Despite this enlightened attitude toward them, throughout Iran's long history, children's condition in general has been severely affected by the invasion of foreigners and catastrophic historical events. The children of deprived families, which were the majority of the society, suffered from economic and social oppression the most. The Constitutional Revolution, 1840 to 1920, caused considerable change in the attitude toward recognition of children's basic rights to food, hygiene, and education. Nevertheless, in the 1920s, the mortality rate among children was very high. 60 to 70% of children under 5 died from hunger and disease. During the 1920s, a number of intellectuals who were mostly educated in the West returned home to take part in building a modern society in Iran. They began improving the daily life of children through establishing hygiene centers, orphanages, and mother and child centers. These Western-trained intellectuals struggled to promote Western ideas concerning child psychology, education, and children's books. In the beginning of the 1920s, only about 5% of the Iranian population was literate. In this period, the traditional schools, Maktabkhane, which had survived the modernization movement in the constitutional era, were substituted by modern schools. Consequently, a group of Western-educated intellectuals such as Kazemzadeh Iranshahr and Mohammad Baqir Hushyar, both of whom studied in Germany, led a kind of child study movement. Their efforts brought about some changes in the educational system and in the publishing of children's books. By the 1940s, following the gradual improvement in children's lives and a more clear definition of children's developmental stages, children were recognized as a group who had special needs which had to be satisfied, whether poor or rich, living in villages or big cities. Among the educated supporters of children's rights in Iranian society was Mehrangiz Manuchehrian, who graduated from Tehran University's law faculty. By 1950, she had written several books on the children's rights. Although social and economic changes in Iran improved children's lives through better health care, increasing the rate of literacy, and imposing laws against child labor, it is very important to consider that the establishment of the United Nations Children's Foundation, UNICEF, after the Second World War brought drastic change in the consideration of children and their needs in many countries, including Iran. The result of UNICEF activities in underdeveloped countries such as Iran was not only relieving children's pain, but changing the attitude toward children in these societies. In the 1940s, child psychology had become a part of the academic discipline for training teachers in the pedagogical department at Tehran University. From 1935 to 1960, nearly 250 students wrote their dissertations on child pedagogy, children's mental development, and psychology. These dissertations helped scholars recognize and focus on the concept of childhood and changed attitudes about children's education and literature. Mohammad Baqir Hushyar was one of Iran's first professors and scholars in child pedagogy and child psychology. He translated and published a couple of basic books for students on these subjects. In 1952, Hushyar and his colleagues started Sepide Farda, the first journal dedicated to pedagogy that featured a vast number of theoretical articles. These discussions led to articles about children's literature. In the 1960s, these activities resulted in the establishment of the Children's Literature Institution in the modern sense of the word. The growth of the number of highly educated people, the increasing rate of literacy, and the extension of the educational system to remote cities and villages played an important role in changing the concept of childhood and the movement of children's literature from an isolated phenomenon to an institutional one. In 1963, a group of children's literature experts and educators founded the Children's Book Council of Iran with the primary objective of developing a national literature specifically for children. This organization was the first non-governmental institute on children's literature. The founders of the Children's Book Council of Iran attempted to spread the idea of childhood, knowledge of children's literature, and the need for children of different ages to have literary books. By collaborating with the country's educational system, the Children's Book Council of Iran tried to respond to the developmental needs of children. The Institute for the Intellectual Development of Children and Young Adults, founded with the support of Queen Farah in 1965, brought about drastic change in children's literature in Iran by employing and encouraging a large number of writers, illustrators, and translators to prepare appropriate high-quality books for children, and by establishing children's libraries in cities or villages around Iran. In spite of the serious efforts made by the Children's Book Council of Iran and the Institute for the Intellectual Development of Children and Young Adults, no unanimous opinion was reached on the concept of childhood concept and children's literature. During this period, many educators and children's writers believed in children's books as educational tools for giving advice to children. In addition to the didactic view, there were also ideological views, both from the left and religious groups toward children's literature. These groups considered children's books as political and ideological tools. The polarization of society after the sudden rise of oil prices and extensive censorship drove the young generation of writers and experts toward symbolic children's literature and acceptance of tendency to regard children's books as a political tool against the government. Samad Behrangi, one of Iran's distinguished writers in the 1960s and 1970s, represented the left's tendency to regard childhood on the basis of historical materialism and sociology. This tendency did not recognize the special developmental needs of children or the rights of children in general. The left believed that children would eventually be involved in social conflicts and they had to be equipped with social awareness through children's books. On the other hand, religious groups believed that the child is an immature creature who should be trained through religious learning. Islamic education ignored most of the special needs of children, and only the needs which were compatible with Islamic regulations were accepted. With the efforts of religious groups and leftist intellectuals, children's literature was changed to an ideological phenomenon in 1960s and 1970s in Iran. After the Islamic Revolution in 1979, the fundamentalists started changing the so-called Western cultural structure. They tried to find a new interpretation of children's literature compatible with revolutionary values and highly supported the works of children's authors inspired by Islamic ideological values. This policy continued during the Iraq-Iran War, when the government needed the young generation's support for the war. The Islamic government not only tried to control the educational system by limiting teachers and librarians to government-issued textbooks and by imposing strict censorship on school libraries, but it also presided over the Institute for the Intellectual Development of Children and Young Adults, which led to the expulsion of many librarians from the Institute's libraries and the removal of books which were evaluated as harmful. After the war, in the 1990s, a more realistic group in the governmental institutes, familiar with international attitudes, started to consider children's literature without focusing on ideological values. During this time, a group of independent authors who had been isolated during these years found more opportunities to be active and create literature for children. Meanwhile, the younger generation and women started a new movement to demand their rights. Many NGOs were formed to respond to the special needs of different groups in society. Some of these NGOs are organizations which are related to children's rights and children's literature. Iranians have been struggling to institutionalize modern values in their society for 150 years. Removing the dependence on ideology from cultural life, specifically in children's literature, is the biggest challenge for most non-governmental organizations which are trying to improve children's lives and children's literature as a literary medium for strengthening intellectual development. Thank you.